Good morning, students. This lecture is for April the 1st. Hope all of you are safe and doing as well as you can. As we begin this last section of our textbook, we move into the era of war. And let's understand that the 20th century is very much going to be characterized by war. We have what is known as World War I. We have World War II. We have the Korean War. We have the Vietnam War. All kinds of wars that characterizes the 20th century. And it has to be one of the most violent centuries in all the history of the world. Now, as we think about Europe in 1914, I want you to imagine a burning powder keg. The fuse is burning down slowly but surely, getting ready to ignite the powder. That is what is going on in Europe. All kinds of situations are contributing to this. And all it will take is one incident, and Europe is going to explode. In fact, I would go so far as to say that many Europeans probably actually wanted a war. They were so naive, so foolish about what a modern war would bring, very much like the United States was in its own Civil War. And so this being naive, not knowing what to expect, is going to bring about a terrible, terrible tragedy in the entire world. Now, the thing that is going to finally set off the powder keg, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, who was an Austrian, went to Sarajevo, and he knew that this was a dangerous trip, but he wanted to show that their annexation by Austria was better than being a part of the Ottoman Empire. And so he knew it was dangerous. And while he is there, he is assassinated by a Serb national, he and his wife. And boom, the world goes to war. Now, basically what happens, Austria declares war on Serbia. Serbia is allied with Russia, so Russia declares war on Austria. Germany is allied with Austria, so Germany declares war on Russia. France is allied with Russia, and so France declares war on Germany and Austria. And when Germany finally will invade Belgium, Britain, who is allied with Belgium, will declare war on Germany. And so it was like pushing dominoes over. One nation followed another nation, followed another nation, and ultimately 32 nations in the world. And let's realize a lot of the countries you and I recognize today did not exist in 1914. So 32 nations of the world was a large portion of the human race being involved in some shape, form, or fashion in this, what Europeans will ultimately call the Great War. So let's look at what the results of the war were. Number one, 5 continents will participate directly or indirectly in this global conflict. It was the first total war in history. It was a war that was industrial, but it was also a war that was waged against civilians. If you were in the way, it was just tough luck. And so, total war, it is going to bring about destruction that is unimaginable. Number 3, it will be the bloodiest in all annals of organized violence up until that point. Millions will die, both military and civilian. Number 4, it's going to seriously damage national economies because countries are going to be pouring things into the war. And of course, that makes other parts of the economy suffer. Plus, trade is virtually going to be shut down. Number 5, it will lead to the redrawing of European boundaries. Literally, new nations are going to wind up appearing as a result of World War I. Number 6, it will cause the demise of 4 empires: the Ottoman, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German. And then finally, it was responsible for an international realignment of power. By the way, power, the struggle for power, the desire to have more power than your potential enemy, of course, is something that is very much going to contribute to the war itself. So, as we look at the results, what are the causes? And these are very, very important for you to understand. Some of them we've already discussed, but let's put them together now. Number 1, the intense nationalism that has arisen in Europe. People recognizing that they are a unique, special, individual group of people, and they may not be like other folks. Number 2, abrasive colonial rivalries. So the imperialism of the late 19th century is a direct contributing factor to bringing about this great war. Number 4, we have the struggle for the balance of power in Europe. And I would define this as being militarism. There was a buildup of massive standing armies by the various European states. By the way, at the beginning of World War I, the United States had the 17th largest army in the world. So we were way behind in that race for developing powerful standing armies. Then we look at the fact that you've got, number 4, national leaders seeking alliances with other powers. And it's inevitable when you have those ties like that, that when one country goes to war, other countries are going to follow suit. So let's talk about some of these a little bit. Late 19th century, we've already talked about nationalism. And as we think about nationalism, that also led to the idea of self-determination, that people of the same ethnic origins, languages, and political ideas had the rights to form sovereign states. A lot of this will take place following World War I, especially in East Central Europe. You'll have a lot of these nationalist aspirations that are going to come to fruition. This will be where the majority of your new nation states will arrive at that time. Otherwise, you had people who were strongly nationalistic, being quite judgmental of those who might be a little bit different. Now, the Turkish Empire had already begun to feel some effects of this nationalist fervor. Greece will get independence from them in 1830. Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, all will follow suit. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire will actually expand its role over the Slavic people, many of whom the Ottomans had dominated. And so people like the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenians, they are all going to be stirred up to the idea of independence and nationalism and being able to form their own nation states. And Russia and Germany add fuel to this because they're on opposite sides. Okay, all the industrial nations, number two, are competing for foreign markets. And so this industrial production trade market is helping bring about tariff wars. And tariff wars tend to rile up the nations who are being taxed for sending their products into a country. And generally they turn around and respond in kind by raising their tariffs. Now, as these national rivalries are developing, realize we've got European nations in Africa, we've got European nations in China, and so to help with this, all of these nations began a huge naval race. In other words, the Germans start building a bigger fleet, so the British, who have tended to dominate the seas since the 7-Year War, they begin to build a bigger fleet, and we're building ships that are known at that time as dreadnoughts. They're actually battleships, super battleships, the biggest, baddest things on the water. And they are supposed to be considered the ultimate naval weapon. Well, with all that's going on, you can imagine in places like Africa, in places like China, you've got tensions between these various colonies of the various European states, and there are going to be local wars, local tensions going on. And then, quite honestly, sadly, as I said, public opinion thinks that Europe might actually need a war. It's been roughly 100 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and no huge war has convulsed Europe since that time. And so there is another problem. People haven't seen the carnage that a war can bring about. Well, quite honestly, what they knew of the Napoleonic Wars is going to be nothing compared to what World War I will turn out to be. So we have the Triple Alliance. This is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then we will have ultimately the Ottoman Turks, and they will join in this. The Allies are basically the French, the British, and the Russians. And Germany tends to be paranoid. They feared being encircled by France and Russia, and they literally, before the war began, had military planners thinking of ways that they could fight a two-front war. That they could fight Russia on one side and France, Britain on the other side. And they decided the ideal thing would be to deliver a knockout blow to France and then use a defensive action against Russia. And it almost worked. Almost. It came close. So, when war is declared, people literally dance in the streets. Now, I don't know about you. I find that to be totally foolish. What a crazy thing to do. We've just declared war. People are going to get killed as a result of this. Economies are going to be damaged as a result of this. So, war began. And yes, quite honestly, here goes Germany on their plan, and they will invade Belgium, come into France, and they will get almost to the city of Paris itself before they are finally stopped. And what happened is suddenly from Belgium through France, basically two large trench lines will develop. And World War I in the West will be bogged down into a trench warfare. And what the trench warfare is a terrible, terrible thing indeed. And I guess the best way I can describe it, you have the two major sides. So you have a series of trenches for the Germans, you have a series of trench for the French and the British. And in between is an area generally called no man's land. Now, one of the new innovations that's going to be used as a weapon in World War I becomes very effective in this no man's land. It's called barbed wire. Yeah, it was invented to keep cattle in place, but it's also a good way to slow or even stop the advance of an enemy. And so no man's land is going to be strung with barbed wire. And literally what is going to take place during this siege are charges and countercharges that gain inches sometimes gain nothing, and cost thousands and thousands of lives. Because we've got some new things in the trenches. We have more modern breech load weapons. You can put a clip in. You have multiple bullets. And so all you have to do is move a lever and you have a new bullet. You don't have to load individually every time you shoot. So that gives you more firepower. They have rapid-fire machine guns, and these things will take thousands of lives because you can just spray bullets over an area and cut down your enemy. And this happened many, many times. Also, the soldiers have what are called hand grenades. These are little devices that you pull a pin, you throw it, and it will explode, hopefully among your enemy. And it will send out shrapnel and do damage within the enemy ranks. And then a very sinister element will be used in the war. Now, supposedly this has been outlawed in our world today, but if you believe it's outlawed, I'll sell you some of that oceanfront property right here in Kimball. But this is gas. Poisonous gas They would launch this into the enemy trenches. This is why you see often pictures of World War I soldiers and they're wearing a gas mask. That is precisely why. I think if I remember correctly, you had 5 seconds. 5 seconds to get that thing on. And some of these gases caused gruesome burns and death to the victims who felt them. So all this is going on in the trenches. And then we have developed more powerful artillery, more accurate artillery. And so not only do we have all this carnage going on in the trenches, but we have the ability from many miles away to shell the enemy. And usually an attack was always going to be preceded by an artillery barrage. So that was kind of a symbol. Hey folks, we're getting ready to come. So here are these things. Well, there are some other items being used in World War I now. Let's remember the airplane is a relatively new thing. Yet by World War I, the airplane is going to become a machine of war in the air. And they're going to be what are called dogfights, where one side will try to shoot down the other. They will build bigger planes and use them to drop bombs on their enemy and on the enemy targets. They will use dirigibles, and these will be great observation things as well as sometimes carrying weapons themselves. And so we have opened up the air to warfare now. We've got it on the ground. We've got it in the air. Well, we've already talked about the development of navies, and so we've got it on the surface of the sea. But something that has had very limited success in world history becomes a major weapon in World War I. It's called the submarine. They've learned a few things. They've learned, number one, you got to be careful not to use up your oxygen or you'll suffocate your entire crew to death. But the Germans are going to use the submarines very, very interestingly in the North Atlantic. They're going to put packs together, wolf packs, they call them. Multiple submarines that are able to attack merchant vessels and sink them as they are seeking to bring supplies to the nations that the Germans view as being their enemies. In fact, submarine warfare will be one of the causes that will bring the United States into World War I. And we might point out very, very quickly here that in the beginning of the war, President Wilson does declare the United States neutral. We're going to try to stay out of this European war. And most Americans are very, very favorable of that. So we'll sell supplies, we'll ship stuff, but hopefully we're not going to be engaging in the combat. Now let's think about being in these trenches. They were wet, they were cold, they could be full of mud, there was lice, you had rats within them. Of course, death and carnage took place all around them, and there was an unrelenting slaughter. Now, the Germans tried to break the deadlock some years later, but it's quite interesting what happened in December of 1914. here we are locked in trench warfare. And as we have noted, Germans like to celebrate Christmas. It's a very, very important time to them. So here we are in the trenches on Christmas Day, 1914, and the Germans start singing Christmas carols. Of course, they keep their heads down because they might get shot by a sniper, but they start singing Christmas carols. Well, the French and the British are not going to be outdone, so they start singing Christmas carols. Well, then some German soldier sticks a little bitty Christmas tree up out of the trench. And before long, literally, the troops are piling out of the trenches into no man's land. And they're kind of having an informal Christmas celebration. A huge soccer game breaks out. Now, I will admit at times it was probably tackle soccer, but soccer games break out. By the way, officers are trying to go back and forth and maybe get how the trenches are laid out and so on of their enemies. So there is some sneaking around going on during all of this. But the point and the message I want you to get is that, quite honestly, in spite of what happened from August to December, had most of those soldiers been given a choice, they would have gone home. The war would have been over. But no, politicians and command officers, they can't stand that. Politicians think there's a glory in war. There's not any glory in people dying, but still, they seem to think there's a glory in it. The command soldiers, there's honor to be upheld. And so instead of letting the war end, the orders are going to be that you can have no fraternization with the enemy. And that's going to end any attempt by the soldiers during World War I to bring about an end to the carnage that is going on. Another thing that might surprise you about World War I is we still have horse-mounted cavalry. Oh yes, there are cavalry charges. There will be thousands upon thousands of horses killed across Europe, from mounted soldiers riding them, from pulling wagons to pulling artillery to carrying supplies, whatever. And of course, we have some innovations for that. We have Jeeps, we have trucks. During the war, even a thing called a tank is going to be developed, which is this huge piece of rolling armor with a artillery projectile shooter on it. And this will begin to become somewhat of a major weapon toward the end of the war. These things can traverse and, of course, go through the barbed wire and other areas like that. So toward the end of the war, they're going to make a difference. So put all of this picture together. You've got modern weaponry. You've still got some ancient tactics. And you've got a definition of glory and honor that, to say the least, is skewed terribly. And you throw all of this together in masses of men, and it is estimated that in 1914 there were 20 million people that entered the military looking for rapid promotions and a quick homecoming. And boy, were they disillusioned after that. And so here is what World War I in the West bogged down into: bloodletting, carnage, because leaders believe that a breakthrough might be able to achieve a major victory in the war. Now, what is awful is that in 1916, still before the United States has entered the war, the Germans try a huge breakthrough at a place called Verdun. Now, the French will win. They will lose in one battle. Now, realize this was not a one-day battle. This was a multi-week battle. They will lose over 315,000. The Germans will lose over 280,000. And they had gained a few thousand yards of territory. What a tragedy. What an awful cost. Okay. After a fairly reasonable defense in the east, German and Austrian forces will overrun Serbia, Albania, and Romania. And they will drive the Russian armies out of East Prussia and then out of Poland. Russia will try to counterattack in 1916 and 1917, and these counterattacks will end in a total collapse and a sea of Russian casualties. And it will be so critical and so bad that Russia will basically agree to this humiliating surrender to get themselves out of the war. And of course, just to jump ahead a little bit, what's going to happen as a result of this, when the Tsar and the armies go back with this defeat, Russia is going to break into a revolution. The Soviets will rise, the Tsar will be overthrown, a new communist government will be established, and so the Russian Empire that so wanted to be a part in many ways of Western Europe will sever itself from all the rest of Europe in becoming the Soviet Union. Okay, so we've got all of these things going on. Now, interestingly enough, World War I can be viewed as profitable for women. As all of these men are going to war and they're fighting, of course, women go into the factories and they begin to manufacture and produce items for use in war. But while economies are being shifted to a war economy, civilians at home are having to make sacrifices themselves. And of course, many of them have already sacrificed their homes as the armies came through and destroyed everything. But there are going to be shortages of food, shortages of supplies, and every government that is involved directly in the war is going to, in some shape, form, or fashion, militarize its civilian war production. And of course, they're going to have planning boards, they're going to have quotas and priorities, what could be produced, what could not be produced. Governments are going to establish wage and prices. They're going to extend work hours and, in some instances, even rescind the retirement of workers. So men march off to war, women march into the factories. And one of the major areas of production for women, of course, is going to be ammunition. Shells, bullets, other things of this nature. Of course, they'll be helping make ships, they'll be helping make airplanes. And Do not get the idea that airplanes were like what we have today. Basically, they were a wood frame overstretched with canvas. Not a whole lot of protection. Of course, they're equipped with machine guns. And of course, canvas doesn't stop machine gun bullets. So the casualties in the air war are going to be many, to say the least. They did not use, for the most part, parachutes. They did not even have seat belts. And so there were cases where people would try to fly and get away from an enemy and turn the wrong way, and the pilot would actually fall out of the plane. And of course, many of them were actually given handguns. So if their plane caught on fire, rather than riding a burning plane all the way to your death at the ground, you could shoot yourself, and at least it would be over a little more quickly. Now, if you think I am trying to paint a horrific picture, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm getting my point across, because this war was horrific. Well, what else are we going to do? Well, we're at war. So we're going to paint through propaganda the worst picture we possibly can of our enemy. We're going to vilify our enemy. We're going to draw funny caricatures of the enemy. And we're going to sell our people that our cause is right and everyone else's cause is wrong. And this is going to have a big impact on how nations not only view each other, but view themselves in comparison with others. Now, I thought about the women again. Shortly after the war, quite interestingly, many nations are going to give women the right to vote. Britain in 1918, Germany 1919, Austria 1919, the United States in 1919. So women workers and what they contribute to the war is quite honestly going to be a very important thing. Okay, so there are three reasons why the war expanded off the continent of Europe. Number one, European countries carried their animosities into their colonies. So when World War I erupts in Europe, you can imagine it's going to erupt in Africa just as well. It's going to erupt in Asia. It's going to erupt in the Pacific and even in India. And so the war is going to lead to fighting within the colonies. Second, because no European nation had enough reserves for the war, Britain and France especially will actually augment their armies by recruiting men from the various colonies. You will have Africans and Indians and Asians that are fighting in their armies to help them have the number of personnel they need to keep an army in the field. And Japan and the United States will ultimately enter the war. So this brings in a nation from Asia as well as a nation from North America. And so all of these factors together will bring in the world into a war of horrendous devastation. Not to be left out, the Ottomans, because everyone else is being involved in their particular conflicts, decides that their Turkish nationalism is going to take out an murderous campaign against the Christian Armenians who are within their territory. It is estimated that more than 1 million Armenians were butchered as a result of what the Turks did. By the way, as is very common in nations that don't want to be honest about their history, Turkey denies this happens. But there are mass graves, just like there will be after World War II with the Nazis. There are mass graves that testify quite to the opposite of the Turkish denials. And so Christians being persecuted by the Muslim Turks and being slaughtered in droves. And it is also said that in the late 19th century, there was another one of these campaigns. So millions of Armenians, and they are some of the oldest Christians on earth, millions of them will die not because they were a part of the war, but simply because they didn't have, quote unquote, the right religion. All right. So, how do we get the United States in the war? And there are actually going to be 3 major components that will bring the United States into the war. Number 1 is that early unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, the United States will protest and protest. The Germans, for a time, will actually let up a little bit, and then they will begin again. And, of course, they're sinking American shipping, taking supplies for the British and the French. Number 2, Mexico, as we noted, is having their own little form of civil war, and a German ambassador tries to get the Mexicans to bring their civil war north into the southwest United States to get the United States' attention away from what is going on in Europe and hopefully keep them out of the war. And through a series of blunders, this information gets to the American government. And that really upsets a lot of sources. Well, as that submarine warfare is renewed again, a British passenger liner. Now, rules said passenger liners should not come under attack, but rules also said they should not carry military supplies. But a British ship, the Lusitania, is crossing the Atlantic, and there are American passengers on board. A German submarine will sink the Lusitania, and this will sort of be the last straw. And the United States will declare war on Germany. This sounds light, it sounds frivolous, but please do not take it that way. Honestly, this could not have happened at a better time, because the Eastern Front, the Russians, have collapsed. And so Germany has been able to pick up that entire army, and now they are moving it west and preparing for a massive counterattack with which they hope to bring about the end of the war. And quite honestly, what will take place is that the United States will have its troops in the field just as this massive counterattack takes place, and the fresh United States forces are going to be able to turn the tide and defeat the German plans. And so America coming in when they did was such such an extremely important thing. Couple of interesting points. When the Americans arrived in France and realized they had to go across on ships, when they arrived in France, many of them disembarked and said, Lafayette, we have come. Kind of a payback. The French had long figured the United States had abandoned their old ally. And so these fresh troops coming in were very, very important. Now, Tennessee will create a hero in this. A young man from up the valley and across the top of the mountain up near the Kentucky border. His name was Alvin York. Kind of a wild young fella. Liked to drink, liked to fight, liked to get into trouble. And then he was converted to Christianity. And as a result of this, he became very serious. Now, he joined a religious group, Christian group, that was pacifist. But they were not registered with the government as being pacifist. It was just a belief they held. And so York is drafted. He goes into the army. But he makes it very clear to his commanders that he doesn't know, because of his religious beliefs, if he can take a human life. He trains. He's an expert shooter, and somewhat comes to be respected by some of his peers, and of course distrusted and disrespected generally by those who were superior to him in rank. Well, still in this dilemma, as he is engaged in the first battle, German machine guns begin to cut loose, and he sees his own men being cut apart. And so they have captured a few Germans. His sergeant has been wounded, and Corporal York is basically in charge of a squad. So he tells his men to stay down. And then one of the amazing stories of World War I. Moving undercover and realize he's a country boy. He knows how to keep himself hidden because he shot game for years. He flanks the Germans. He engages 5 to 7 Germans in hand-to-hand combat, and he realizes he can take human life, because he does. By the way, he comes up with a lovely little souvenir, a German Luger, which is a very, very well-made pistol. Well, then he gets on the side of the trench. Now, York hunted ducks. When you're hunting ducks, you don't shoot the lead duck, because all the rest of the ducks will immediately scatter off. So what you do, you start at the back and work your way up shooting the ducks. Well, he gets beside the trench, starts making turkey calls, and German soldiers start sticking their head up. And to quote him, he tetched them off. In other words, one by one, by one, by one, by one, he starts shooting German soldiers. And the Germans think they have totally been flanked, and there's a whole bunch of Americans, and so they surrender. And so here one man brings a company of German soldiers down the hill, and there are only 7 Americans. As it will turn out, they will capture well over 200 men, march them quite a distance to be able to turn them over to American authorities, and York will suddenly become an instant hero. Now, when he was asked by his officers what changed his heart and mind, he made an interesting statement. He said the machine guns were killing hundreds, and he figured he could save lives by taking lives. Amazing thought. York will receive France's highest award. He will receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. He will become an American hero. He'll come back home to ticker tape parades in New York, and ultimately he'll return to northern Tennessee, to a farm the state of Tennessee provides for him, and you can go up there today and see where Alvin York spent the rest of his life. Didn't intend to be a hero, didn't intend to be anything but who he was. But of course, many times in war, men are thrust into positions that they do not want, and as a result of that, many of them do extraordinary things. So there we have a Tennessee hero. All right, let's think about Russia a little bit. We touched on the fact that Russia did so poorly that by the spring of 1917, they're having to pull out of the war. Tsar Nicholas II, who happens to be the last Tsar, will advocate the throne. He will be hunted down by an individual named Vladimir Lenin. By the way, Nicholas's father had executed Lenin's brother. And so ultimately, through a struggle, the Bolsheviks, as they were called, will get control, and they will totally overthrow the government. The Winter Palace, as it was called, will be taken, and Lenin and his Bolshevik party will take over. There will be a 5-year civil war following that devastated the country, with the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, defeating the White Army. And so Russia will then move into a communist form of government with, again, a very autocratic leadership. Now, one thing about poor Nicholas, and you kind of have to feel sorry for him in a way, he meant well, but it seemed like everything he tried to do fell apart. It went wrong. They were celebrating an anniversary of the Romanov family being head of the Russian government, and so he had a teacup and saucer crafted for every Russian citizen. And when they were giving those out in St. Petersburg, people were so anxious to get their teacup and saucer that individuals were actually trampled to death trying to get those things. And that's just kind of how his czarship went. One blunder, one bad piece of luck after another. And of course, Lenin will get his payback in that the Tsar, his wife, and all of his children will be executed. Well, as you can imagine, by 1917, as the U.S. is coming in, you've got a lot of governments in trouble, especially the German Austria. There are food shortages. People are demonstrating against their food rations. Governments react harshly against that. And of course, the governments turn very unpopular in the minds of the people. So this is why in 1918, in the spring, the Germans will throw their last assault, hoping they can win the war. And the U.S. will help break that stranglehold. Now, the U.S. actually only engaged in about 2 major battles. Realize these took on weeks and months of activity, but yet two major battles in the war. And so finally, the German command realized they could not win the war because the U.S. could keep sending in fresh troops. And so before they were backed up and German territory started being conquered, they determined to sign an armistice. And it took effect at 11 o'clock at night on November 11th, 1918. We still celebrate November 11th as a time for the ending of the war. Now let's talk about the end of the war. Of course, President Wilson has not had the United States engaged all that long. But even as the war began, and we need to say something about President Wilson. Number one, he was a social studies professor. So a great guy, college teacher. He was a very moral man. He prayed daily, studied his Bible daily, and all of these things had a tremendous impact upon his decision-making ability. And Wilson came up with what were called 14 points. Now, I will say, if the British and French had listened to him, things might have turned out differently in Europe. But they didn't. And of all the presidents of the United States, I have to say that Woodrow Wilson is the president I feel most sorry for. He went to Europe, he left the U.S., he was a hero. He lands in France, he's a hero. Everywhere he goes, he's a hero. And the British and the French will basically not listen to him. They will throw down his proposals, and as a result of that, literally set up World War II. Now, let me say some things here. The 4 clauses of the Versailles Treaty that I'm about to give you are literally the 4 causes of World War II. The Germans will say they were forced to sign this treaty at the point of a bayonet, and you will understand why as we go through these. But as we read these, at the end of this treaty, with all the new concrete and things being poured in Europe, you could have written in every bit of fresh concrete, we're gonna have a new war. And you would have been right. This set up World War II. So here are your treaties of World War I, your causes of World War II. Number 1, Germany must accept sole responsibility and guilt for causing the war. Well, wait a minute. It was Austria. Germany just came in on the side of their ally. But they have to assume total responsibility. Number 2, Germany is required to reduce its military tremendously. And that means arms, troops, everything. There has to be a reduction. In fact, it will be after the war that you will have German troops training with brooms instead of rifles as they learn how to march. Number 3, the defeated Central Powers, so this would be mainly Germany and Austria and even the Ottomans to an extent, have to pay for the war. And then, number 4, France will take some territory from Western Germany. So you can see how this would totally humiliate the German people, and how, at least behind the scenes, they would be enraged by this. And of course, all of these things then are going to send Germany into a crashing depression even before the United States enters its depression. So, what's going to happen here? Bulgaria, that kind of sided with the Germans, will lose a little territory. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire will be broken up. You will have Austria, you will have Hungary coming out, and both of them will suffer losses. The defeated Ottomans will be dissolved as an empire and pretty much put into what is now the modern state of Turkey. You will have Allied occupation forces in Ottoman territory, and they will be in Iran, Iraq, and other places. You'll have some new nation states arise, as I told you at the beginning of this. Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, we're back on the map again, hooray! Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, a lot of these coming from the Ottomans and from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So these ethnic groups begin to be able to emerge and bring about their independence in the New World. Okay, so here we have a war that everybody claimed was the war to end all wars. Guess what, folks? They miserably failed. Miserably failed. By the way, poor President Wilson, when he comes back home, is pretty much a defeated man. This is why I feel so sorry for him. Now, one of his ideas takes hold somewhat in Europe. Wilson wanted to propose a League of Nations where countries would come together and meet and discuss things instead of being divided up into these various treaty and so on groups. And the League of Nations to Europeans seems like a feasible idea. But when he returns home, Americans want to go back into isolationism. We don't want to be tied up with these crazy warring European nations. And so he can't even sell the League of Nations to the United States. Congress and the people all will wind up rejecting it. So, Germany looks at everything that is going on, and they basically feel like Europe has spit in their face. They're forced to accept what has happened, but that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination they're happy. And so underneath, deep down inside, Germany is going to be seething. And all it is going to take is for some charismatic type of leader to come along, and he's going to be able to awaken and revive the German people and probably this time awaken and revive them in a way that the world could never imagine. And of course, I'm sure you're all thinking, okay, I'm thinking about Adolf Hitler. And that's exactly who I am thinking about. All it will take is some dynamic leader, and he will come along and he will be able to look at the Versailles Treaty and the things that happened afterwards. And of course, I'm paraphrasing very liberally here, but he will basically look at all of this and say, look what they did to us. Look how they treated us. Look how they humiliated us. And he's going to be able to stir up the German people into a frenzy. And he will create a frenzy that will once again, even more so than World War I, that will convulse the entire world. And of course, we'll deal with some of his ideas in a future lecture. Well, before 1914, the U.S. was a debtor nation. But now, by 1919, the U.S. is a creditor nation. And for the first time in history, the United States is viewed as a world power. We're no longer those people on the other side of the pond. We're somebody that came in and made a major difference. And the world is forever changed. Now, one thing that will happen, and this will lead us into our next chapter, Europe, if you recall, during the Enlightenment, had the idea of progress. We're going to have progress. Progress is always going to take place. Well, World War I shattered that. Totally shattered that. And quite honestly, two different philosophies are going to arise. In the 1920s, for the most part, there are going to be many in America that want to party, celebrate. We're going to throw down the past. We're going to change morals. We're going to do all of this, that, and the other. Boy, Europe is in a depression. And they are in a depressed mood. And things are solemn, and literature is depressive, and it's a struggling time for Europe because, quite honestly, their delusions were totally shattered. And so we'll pick up this thought in our next lecture. Please take care. Keep yourself safe.